Love and then do what you want. This is how St. Augustine summarizes the teaching of Jesus about how we are to live. Love and then do what you want. There is, it looks like, a certain agreement between the Beatles and St. Augustine. They sing, all you need is love. Much depends, of course, on what love really is. In 1941, Karol Wojtyła was still a student of Polish literature 1 year before he entered the underground seminary in Krakow. Hitler decided to remove from Polish parishes most of the priests. He left 1 or 2 in parishes. Probably there would have been a violent reaction, but many of these priests were brought to concentration camps and eventually killed. This happened in Karol Wojtyła's parish as well, and he came under the care of a tailor, a layman, about whom he says later, as Pope, that he considers him a true mystic, a true saint. That tailor introduced Karol Wojtyła to the writings of St. John of the Cross, also St. Louis de Montfort, but especially St. John of the Cross. Right away, young Karol Wojtyła learned Spanish to read St. John of the Cross in the original. It's fantastic. You see his decisiveness. 7 years later, he finished a dissertation at the Angelicum about St. John of the Cross, the notion of faith in St. John of the Cross. I want to begin by talking about 2 important, you can call them maybe foci, that Karol Wojtyła learned from St. John of the Cross. When St. John of the Cross was dying, his brothers were assembled around him and were reading the usual prayers for the dying. He waved them aside and said, "Read me the Song of Songs." Now, in the Song of Songs, there are many rich things in the Song of Songs, but there's one refrain that St. John of the Cross seems to pick up on particularly. 3 times in the course of the poem, the bride says, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." Again, "My beloved is mine, and I am his." The 3rd time she says, she varies it a little bit, "My beloved is mine, and his desire is for me." Of course, you can say, if my beloved is mine and I am his, what is it that takes place between us? A gift. A gift of what? A gift of self. The innermost dynamism of love, according to St. John of the Cross, is the gift of self. One person given to another. St. John of the Cross expressed his grasp of love particularly in poetry. And it was to read St. John's poetry that Wojtyła mainly learned Spanish. In St. John of the Cross, there's a great sense of the beauty of love, of that love between God and human beings. I think this is one important aspect of what Karol Wojtyła gleaned from St. John of the Cross. The other is, St. John of the Cross is always attentive to Christian experience. That is, he's interested not only in the question of doctrine, of the truth of the faith, but in the question, what does this actually mean when you live a Christian life? How do you sense, how do you experience Christian life? From this point on, from his encounter with St. John of the Cross on, these two became also a focus for Karol Wojtyła, a very clear sense of the beauty of love, especially with the concept of the gift of self, and attention to Christian experience. Let me read to you a couple of passages of St. John to show you how similar the ring, the sound of St. John is to Wojtyła. I gave myself to him, keeping nothing back. There I promised to be his bride. This is from the Spiritual Canticle. And in the commentary on it, he says, the bride tells of the mutual surrender made in this spiritual espousal between the soul and God. She most willingly and with intense delight surrenders herself wholly to him in the desire to be totally his. Each surrenders the entire possession of self to the other with a certain consummation of the union of love. By the way, the voice of the baby is very welcome, so don't worry about it at all. We're talking about love between man and woman. Now, Wojtyła in Love and Responsibility. The essence of spousal love is self-giving, the surrender of one's I. The fullest, the most uncompromising form of love consists precisely in self-giving, in making one's inalienable and non-transferable I someone else's property. Again, St. John, each surrenders the entire possession of self to the other with a certain consummation of the union of love. And John Paul II in Familiaris Consortio writes, the total physical self-giving would be a lie if it were not the sign and fruit of a total personal self-giving, in which the whole person, including the temporal dimension, is present. That is, forever, for my whole life, the temporal dimension. If the person were to withhold something or reserve the possibility of deciding otherwise in the future, by this very fact, he or she would not be giving totally. It seems to me that in St. John and in Wojtyła's contact with him, you can grasp the sources out of which Karol Wojtyła's concern for love between man and woman comes. He writes in Crossing the Threshold of Hope that as a young priest, quote, as a young priest, I learned to love human love. If one loves human love, there naturally arises the need to commit oneself completely to the service of fair love. Because love is fair, it is beautiful. Extremely important, with a sensibility for the beauty of love trained by St. John, Wojtyła dedicates himself as a young man to the service of fair love. This is what young people are really deeply looking for, he's convinced. The first appointment that the young priest received, Karol Wojtyła, one of the first appointments, was as a student pastor at the University of Krakow. And he became close friends there with a number of young couples, student couples. I've been able to talk to some of them, and they remember the extraordinary insight and sensitivity with which Karol Wojtyła accompanied them along their way of love, the impact he had on them. Again, it's out of these experiences of the young priest that the energy and the structure even of the theology of the body seems to flow. The pastoral method of John Paul II seems to derive from this. The pastoral method is to show the beauty of love, to let the beauty of love show itself. There are fantastic passages in the Theology of the Body that also with great poetic force show that beauty. That's one aspect. And the other is addressing the experience of the person. This proposal of love is something to be verified in actual experience. This method is extremely effective. I found out about it to my surprise. 10 years ago, I began working in Austria, building up a new theological institute, and I had to teach the theology of the body. My wife is also professor of theology. We studied it together, and it surprised us. The effect of studying that text was in some way like a second honeymoon. Suddenly, new life sprang up in our relationship. I saw and felt my own body and hers differently than before. I think with more open eyes, with a more gentle touch, with a sense of awe before the mystery that God's holiness expresses itself through what we do. I'm confident that this power, this pastoral power, will exercise itself even more in the future. Christopher West has been helping for it to reach people. This will continue, without a doubt. There are, in many countries already, but especially in the United States, groups of young people who meet and who find that their experience is really transformed. The more I studied the theology of the body, the more I was also convinced that it was a towering intellectual achievement. But I didn't see that right away. My impression when I first read it was, as I went along, I don't know where I am. I don't know where I'm going. The argument seems to be deep, but where is it exactly? And I found myself wanting, and I was sure there would be such a thing, an outline by Pope John Paul II himself in which the nature of the argument would be laid out. In the other English edition, what you have is simply the Wednesday talk with a title given not by John Paul II himself, but the editors of the Osservatore Romano, but you have no indications, chapter 1, chapter 2, and so on. So I was convinced somewhere in his papers there would be such an outline. After his death, I approached Archbishop Dziwisz. There's a long story of him postponing, showing me the papers, postponing, until the last time I talked to him, he said, "I'm going to Krakow now. You can speak to this and that person at the Secretariat of State." So I called there, and that person said, "Well, now the papers are out of the hand of Archbishop Dziwisz. They will be locked up for the next 50 years, which was a sharp disappointment. Nevertheless, I went to the John Paul II archives. There are some things that are public, together with a Polish friend, a priest who also teaches in Gaming, where I teach. And there we found the manuscript, the completed book manuscript, apparently it was ready to be sent to the publisher, of a work called Man and Woman, He Created Them, with a beautiful division of the whole into 2 parts, each part with 3 chapters, each chapter subdivided even more, 5 levels deep. That I found simply fascinating because it allowed me to follow the argument step by step. And if you use those headings to really follow the argument, you can. My respect for John Paul II's mind, which was already great reading some of his other things, rose very, very much. Tremendous intellectual stature. Christopher already indicated that John Paul II in the Theology of the Body is not concerned only with the question of love between man and woman. He's concerned with the deep questions of our age, which are mainly the question of science, what's the proper way of knowing nature, and power over nature. You find in him, also in some of his other writings, the analysis, and in particular Descartes, whom you mentioned whom he talks about in the quote that you read, Christopher. At the beginning of the scientific revolution, the conscious attempt was made to reconstruct the whole of human knowledge with the aim of power over nature in mind. Descartes is absolutely clear about this, as was Francis Bacon before him. It was quite natural that this changed the way science operated, what it looked for. Very quickly, natural science became dominated by mathematics. Mathematics is what's closest to the science of mechanics, which Descartes was so interested in. If you figure out the math, you can control the thing. More and more, bodily reality was seen in mathematical terms. So the only thing that this everything has fundamentally is mathematical properties and a mechanical structure. This reconstruction of knowledge, you could say, emptied physical nature of its meaning. Our body is a meaningless mechanism. You may have heard even Catholic moralists say, God doesn't worry about what we do with our bodies as long as we love each other and are respectful for each other. Here you see the split between the person and the body. The person is not at home in the body. because the body is just a machine. The person is at home only in a spiritual, intellectual, legal realm apart from the body. So the thrust of the theology of the body is a very deep one. It's a direct challenge against, you could say, the scientific establishment. John Paul II says, what was the body created for? The body, in fact, and only the body, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. It has been created, notice this now, this is fantastic, to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden from eternity in God, and thus to be a sign of it. The incarnation in the text you read is the key element where God's truth, God's holiness comes through bodily reality into the world. But this is the manner in which we are to regard our own bodies. Our own bodies have been created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery of God who is love in himself, God who is the Trinity. That holy reality is to be transferred through the body into the world. Let me conclude by saying a few things about the marvelous the marvelous cover that Pauline designed with the creation of Adam. Usually we overlook Eve, who is under God's other arm. What Pauline did is they grayed out the background so Eve stands out. I should bring it further down here. So fragile, I don't know whether I would get it down in one piece. As God is creating Adam and infusing power into him, the idea of Eve is already in his mind. Eve has not yet been created. She's in God's mind. She's already there. She looks with intense fascination at Adam. God actually looks down at the finger of Adam and his own finger. Adam looks at God's face, but also by God's face into Eve's eyes. It's a fantastic portrayal of what Pope John Paul II is talking about. You could call this the Michelangelo Code. The woman is really there from the beginning. Thank you very much.